Support for Audacious with Chion Wolf provided by a generous contribution from Suzanne Hopgood in memory of Frank Lord.
From Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford, this is Audacious. I'm Chion Wolf. There are still people on Earth who've never seen a photograph, or a stoplight, or a cell phone, or listened to public radio. There are children who've never watched a cartoon, never blown bubbles, or pressed a button. They are among the last people on Earth living almost entirely beyond the modern world, and almost nobody is allowed anywhere near them. History has taught us that whenever outsiders arrive in these remote locations, disease, violence, and exploitation usually arrive with them. So imagine being invited to accompany one of the only expeditions in the world that is permitted to enter that kind of place. Not to discover people or influence them, not even to meet them. In fact, in the story you're about to hear, the goal was almost the opposite: to spend weeks trudging through one of the most unforgiving jungles on Earth, in the far western Brazilian Amazon, near the border with Peru, hoping never to make contact with humans at all, but to gather just enough information to help protect one of the last uncontacted tribes on the planet from everyone who might come after. Journalist and National Geographic contributor Scott Wallace said yes to this assignment. The expedition would become one of the defining experiences of his life and the basis for his book, The Unconquered. He begins that story with a confession, because despite knowing exactly why they shouldn't meet the Arrow people, a part of him secretly hoped they would. Here's Scott Wallace reading from the prologue.
I was following on the heels of Sidney Pozuelo. He was the leader of this expedition into the land of this uncontacted tribe, the Flecheiros. There was no way to know exactly how the tribe would react to our presence. They had little reason to view us as anything other than a hostile, invasive army. And not unreasonably, for despite our best intentions, any direct contact with the Flecheiros or Arrow people could be disastrous. The tribe had no immunity to the germs we carried. We were not doctors and carried few medicines. We, too, were in danger. There was little chance for escape in the walled-in jungle if their curare-tipped arrows began to fly. Yet, who among us, yes, even the purest Pozuelo, didn't secretly hope for a first contact, that moment on the cutting edge of history when complete and utter strangers from separate universes stand face to face, look one another in the eye, and recognize their common humanity? That was how I liked to imagine it. Smiles, handshakes, an exchange of gifts, a rewriting of the epochal encounters at Roanoke or Tenochtitlan, an experience for all time, a tale to recount to wide-eyed children and grandchildren. Come on, Grandpa, tell us about the time you met the wild Indians in the jungle. We'd bedazzle the world with images of the Stone Age savages, appear on the Today Show, become celebrity journalists. Maybe I'd even get a book contract.
Thank you. Will you take us back to the early 2000s? You went out to the Amazon in Brazil for 10 weeks. What was this project, and how did you hear about it? How did this all start?
I was interested in indigenous people and struggles in the Amazon. I'd been doing some reporting in Brazil ever since the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And I came to this interest in conflict over land and resources in the world's last great wilderness regions. And those regions, by and large, overlap with homelands of traditional cultures, indigenous people. And I came to this interest through my conflict reporting and early on in my career. I was in Central America for 7 years in the 1980s, covering the conflicts in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. And with the end of the Cold War, and as the kind of newly unshackled global economy, hungry for resources, started moving into these deep wilderness regions, I decided that was the conflict that I wanted to follow and cover. In this particular case, I had been knocking on the door of National Geographic for a while with some story ideas involving indigenous people and deep hinterland frontier regions where resources were coveted by profit-hungry, powerful players.
Tale as old as time. Yeah.
Right. And where the indigenous people largely found themselves as frontline defenders in this struggle. In this particular case, I had been working in Brazil and I had been pitching a story about illegal logging in the Amazon. And I just came back from being there when the editor at the Geographic that I was trying to get this project going with sent me an email, Scott, please call me ASAP. And it turned out that they had decided to do a profile of Sidney Pozuelo, the leader of the expedition that I would go on. And Pozuelo was this extraordinary man who had led a change in Brazil's official policy toward its indigenous people. Pozuelo belongs to this uniquely Brazilian profession called sertanistas. They're adventurers, explorers, indigenous rights activists, ethnographers, anthropologists, all wrapped into a single profession called the sertanista. And Pozuelo was one of these sertanistas, and he had led a movement in the late 1980s to change Brazil's policy from going out into the bush and making contact with the so-called untamed wild tribes in order to move them out of the way of the advancing frontier and to provide a more humanitarian outcome for them by moving them into, reserves or staking out their territories. But what Pozuelo found and others like him found was that no matter how humanitarian or humane the approach they took trying to peacefully make contact with these tribes, after contact was made, they'd start dying off in huge numbers because the uncontacted groups in the Amazon possess no immunity to the germs that we carry. Flu, measles, pneumonia, even the common cold can be deadly for these tribes. And so what Pozuelo and his colleagues saw was even when they tried to make peaceful contact and save these tribes from the advance of the frontier, they'd start dying off. And so he and some others led this movement to change Brazil's policy with the last remaining wild tribes of the Amazon to, instead of contacting them to save them without contact. And so their mission became, let's find where these tribes are, avoid contact with them, but do fact-finding missions to determine the extent of their wanderings and create reserves and expel anyone who doesn't belong in there, all non-indigenous from the area. And so Pozuelo had led this incredible change in Brazil's policy. And the Geographic decided to do a profile of him. And Pozuelo was heading off on one of his expeditions into the land of the Flecheiros, the Arrow people, on one of these missions. And so my assignment was to follow him, originally just going upriver in a series of boats until the expedition got to the point where the boats could go no further. And at that point, the expedition was going to leave the boats and start this grueling overland interfluvial trek.
And at this point, did you know you would be following him through to this next step of
I did not.
No.
I did not. I was with him on the boats, and we had gone up a tributary of the Amazon on a flotilla of 4 or 5 boats till we got to the point where the river was getting too shallow, and we left those boats behind, and those boats were trailing skiffs, shallow draft skiffs. Then the skiffs, we went as far as we could on the skiffs. And at that point, this was like 2.5 weeks into the expedition since I joined. And at that point, the boats were going back, and the expedition was now going to proceed into the forest on basically an open-ended mission into the deepest, wildest part of the Amazon. And I had to make a decision. Do I continue or do I stick to the plan and turn around and go back?
Because up until this point, your job was to profile him and photograph him and the surroundings to that in that area. But if you were to continue, that's an entirely different life story for you, and you knew that, yeah?
I had an inkling that it was. We still had a satellite phone that worked, and I called my editor at the Geographic, and I explained to him that phone, by the way, later did not work. But I called him and explained, and we agreed for a very modest increase in the fee that they would pay me, like ridiculously modest when I think about it now. But I put it to him, and I thought, I guess I have enough material to write this, but I don't think I can live with myself if I finish my story by saying, and with that, Pozuelo disappeared into the jungle and National Geographic went home. I couldn't do it. So I agreed to continue.
Now, did you have, I know this is technical stuff, but this is the early 2000s. What camera gear did you have, and did you have enough to do this?
Well, there was another photographer from the Geographic on the assignment. So my major role was to write the story, but also to take pictures. And frankly, I did not. I had a couple of cameras, but I was not at all. I wasn't prepared for the humidity. And for example,
Wait a minute, is this film?
Film,
Ugh.
yeah. So we're talking about pretty much pre-digital. I mean,
On the cusp.
On the cusp. And frankly, the digital cameras weren't so great back then, so it was film. But one thing I didn't realize, that you could not even keep a roll of film in your camera overnight without the film sticking to itself, and you lost. So there were some key rolls of film during the trek that I lost because I didn't realize that the humidity. I mean, we're talking about 98, 99% humidity all the time.
As a photographer who's used to having access to the people or objects, places that you're going to be photographing, when you imagined the possibility that the camera in your hands could photograph these people who don't want to be found, should not be even near you, what was going on in your psyche when you pictured the possibility that the camera in your hands might photograph these people?
I couldn't really imagine what that was going to look like in advance, but as the expedition proceeded, after we left the boats behind and we started this grueling overland trek, it became clear how things were unfolding. We were moving through the jungle in a single file with the lead scouts hacking open the jungle with their machetes, the trailblazers. Pozuelo was right there near the front, and I was right there pretty much behind him, that if there was going to be a first contact with the Flecheiros, the arrow people, it was going to be in a very dense, very challenging situation and place with closed-in jungle all around. It wouldn't be in some flat, open terrain where you could see a lot. You could barely see a couple of people at any one time, given this situation that we were in, following the lead scouts in this single file through the jungle.
So I'm sensing a bit of trepidation. Is that one word?
There was trepidation for sure, particularly once we kind of had the idea that they knew we were there.
How did you know they knew you were there?
So probably around a week after we had left the boats behind and we were trekking every day and making a new campsite, a new bivouac, and then moving on the next morning. A week into that overland journey, we encountered the first signs of the Flecheiros. We saw an abandoned fishing camp, some ceramic bowls that they had left behind, a dilapidated palm frond roofed shelter. And then as we proceeded, more of these kinds of signs would appear.
How did it feel to see them?
It was amazing. It was like, in a way, it was like time travel, right? I mean, epic kind of time travel across, millennia, to have the sense that we were in the land of people who had never heard of Brazil, Jesus Christ, Christopher Columbus, Nothing. And the indigenous scouts that were with us, so this was a 34-member expedition, which included 20 indigenous scouts from 3 different tribes from the area. And one of the reasons that Pozuelo had created this mix in the expedition was in case there was an inadvertent encounter with the Arrow people, we thought maybe one of the languages represented among the tribes who were with us would be close enough to what they spoke so that they could understand. But the idea was to avoid contact. But nonetheless, as we continued, the scouts who were with us, amazing, like they were amazing hunters, trackers, could carry incredible amounts of weight. They would move through the jungle barefoot. And these trackers, as we moved through the jungle, they could date more or less like how old one of these vestiges was. Like a broken branch would be, so forest people, when they move through the jungle, snap off saplings as they go at hand level. And they use that almost like breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel, to find their way back. And so these snapped branches, they're not broken off completely, and they start to heal. And the scouts would look at these, they called them quebradas, breaks, and they could date, oh, this is from last year, or this is from last month, or this is from a week ago. And as we went deeper in, the vestiges became more recent until there was one day, now this is like 3 weeks since we left the boat behind, when one of the scouts pointed to a footprint in the mud and said, this is from right now. And so everyone was like, oh my God, they're like right here. And then we could actually hear voices up ahead, kind of shouted whispers going back and forth. And at that point, Pozuelo called a member of each of the 3 tribes to the front of the column to yell out into the forest and he said, tell them we're here on a friendly mission. We're just passing through. We're not here to harm them. And so each of the indigenous languages rang out into the forest. But at that point, we knew that they knew that we were there in their homeland.
I just need like a minute. This is intense. As this is happening around you, it sounds like it happened really quickly. And I imagine your hands are on your camera. Your ears are wide open. Your heart is racing because mine is just freaking hearing about this. What was going on in you?
Yeah, I mean, it was like, oh my God, my heart's racing. I'm wondering, how am I going to cover this? How am I going to get images? What if we see them? All those things racing through my mind at the same time that I've got to be careful not to like step in front of Pozuelo or kind of interfere with his work. So,
were you afraid in any way for your life?
At that moment, no, but later on, yes. This was the moment when a couple of them understood that there were intruders in their land. It seemed like there were too many of us and too few of them to be concerned, and they took off running. But then we're beginning to think, okay, it's just a matter of time now before word spreads through the territory that there's a potentially hostile invading force inside their territory. And what are they going to do about it? So then it became more tense. At night, we started posting sentries to guard against a possible attack. One of the several calculuses that Pozuelo had made was to create this large force, because nobody had ever gone into the Arrow people's land before without being attacked or killed. So he created this force to be large enough to act as a deterrent so they wouldn't try to attack us. Plus, everyone except me and Nicholas, the photographer, were armed with rifles. The rifles were principally used for hunting. That's how we survived. The animals, the team hunted. But it's also for deterrence, to just show them. There were many of us and well-armed, but never to shoot at them. The standing orders were in compliance with Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Agency's motto is die if you must, but never kill. And so the standing orders were, even if we were attacked, just to fire warning shots in the air, never directly at the Arrow people. But we posted sentries at night thinking there might be an attack. But this calculus that Pozuelo made that we were many and we also had guns, which even though they're an uncontacted tribe, there's like no tribe left in the world, as uncontacted as they may be, who do not know what a rifle is.
Right. I was wondering that too, especially after it's fired as a warning shot. You don't have to really imagine what that means. Yeah. Can we pause at the nighttime, and will you tell me what the Amazon sounded like at night?
So there was always a kind of baseline trilling of insects. And then you would hear twigs snapping or rustling in the trees or animals crying out. And indigenous people are experts at replicating the sounds of birds or animals. And so it was never clear after that first near encounter, when I would lie awake at night listening, if any of those things I was hearing were actually signals that the Arrow people were using to coordinate their movements.
How'd you sleep?
Actually, during the trek, very well, because it was exhausting. I mean, we were crossing through the headwaters of 4 different rivers, so it was just a kind of a lattice work of streams and steep ravines, embankments that we had to traverse. It was exhausting. We really didn't have that much to eat. I slept pretty well, I have to say, for the most part. But I'd wake up in the night and just lie there listening to the jungle and wonder what was going on. Yeah. Oh, and I should say, it's amazing how cold the jungle gets at night.
What the hell?
Yeah, right? And I was ill prepared for that. So, yeah, I've been in the Amazon before, but not in that kind of deep jungle. And so I had to wrap myself in my poncho, and I often shivered in the nighttime. So I guess maybe I didn't get the kind of sleep that, I thought maybe I had, yeah.
So how close did you get? After the break, journalist and Yukon Associate Professor Scott Wallace tells the rest of the story. You're hearing sounds from the Javari Valley Indigenous Territory in the Brazilian Amazon, where he spent 10 weeks documenting an expedition to protect one of the world's last uncontacted tribes. When we get back, okay, how close did he actually get?
I went down to the river, and I heard kerplunk.
I'm Chion Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay with me. This is Audacious. I'm Chion Wolf. Today we're talking with journalist and Yukon Associate Professor Scott Wallace. His book, The Unconquered, tells the story of the 10 weeks he spent deep in the Brazilian Amazon on a rare expedition to help protect one of the world's last uncontacted tribes. The expedition wasn't searching for the tribe so they could interact with them. They were searching for signs that the tribe was still there, so Brazil could continue protecting its territory and keep outsiders away. When we left off, I asked him how close he thinks he got to the Arrow people.
One evening after dinner, a dinner of, I don't know what exactly it was. It might have been monkey, which we had quite a lot of, sickeningly, or wild boar or something. I went down to the river to wash my plate and spoon off. And I was down there alone at the edge of the river, and I heard kerplunk, and I thought nothing of it. Oh, something just dropped from a tree. And so I kept scrubbing them. Kerplunk, again, kerplunk, more of them, getting closer so I could see them in the water. And I realized at a certain point that, this wasn't just random stuff falling from the trees. Somebody was throwing stuff, and the river was not that wide. And I realized if they were able to like throw stuff and drop these little coconuts into the water, they were certainly close enough to like hit me in the chest with an arrow. And I beat a hasty retreat back up the bank after that.
So did you see them? Did you ever see them?
At the end of the expedition, we did an overflight of the route that we took that took 2.5 months to follow. We did in a couple of hours by plane. And we saw them. I saw them from the plane. And they were, scattering around, looking up at us.
Will you describe the scene?
There was a jungle clearing. You could see a number of thatched roofed huts, low-lying huts around this clearing. Interestingly, there were also gardens planted. You could see there were toppled trees. You could see tree stumps, toppled trees, and plantations, like rows of manioc and what I think were papaya. Yeah, and then you could see people kind of moving around this clearing and kind of ducking behind under the roof and peering out. But we didn't get, we wanted to go in lower so we could, get decent images. And Pozuelo was like, no, we're not allowed to go in. That'll scare the living daylights out of them. We're keeping a respectful distance. But yeah, that's how I saw them.
How did it feel like to see them?
It was amazing. It really was amazing. So I was thinking about this at the time, like what could they make of the plane? And during the expedition, so of the 3 indigenous groups with us, there was the single largest ethnicity of any in the expedition were the Machis. There were 12 from this tribe, the Machis, and they had experienced first contact only 30 years before. And of the 12 Machis in the expedition, more than half of them were old enough to have vivid memories of what life was like pre-contact. And so some of their stories were phenomenal, and I would ask them, I was trying to get a sense of like what the Flecheiros must think of us and what would they make of us being in their land. And so they had some really interesting stories, including I asked one night there was, we could hear a plane crossing the sky. I said, so what do you think the Flecheiros make of that? And one of the Machis said, well, we used to think that those planes that fly way up there were our ancestors checking on us to check on our well-being. And then he said, and then those other planes that would swoop in low over our village, we thought were monsters. So I'm thinking, maybe they thought we were monsters and or thought our plane was a monster. They would not have had any way of knowing that there were people on board the plane that we were in.
I don't know why I feel emotional hearing this, but I think about how none of us know what this thing is being here in these bodies and on this planet. Really, we have no idea what this is. And all of a sudden to imagine that, it breaks my heart a little bit to think that they saw those planes way, way up and that it was their ancestors. It breaks my heart. I don't know. How did you react to that?
Yeah, it was, very emotional. I thought, wow.
Because it's not true.
Yeah.
And it's so sacred.
Yeah. The world is full of wonder and magic and mystery. And that was one of the things that I learned on this trip, more than I understood it before.
What was it like to leave?
Well, the way we ended up getting out of there was pretty extraordinary. So it took us 3 weeks trekking across their land to get to a point where the stream that we had been following, one of the 4 streams that we had encountered in our up and down journey, we started following one of them. And not randomly. Pozuelo knew what the stream was. It was turning into a major river. And by the time we got to a point where we were pretty much outside the Flecheiros territory, but not entirely out, we stopped on the banks of this river, and Pozuelo ordered a halt to the march, set everyone to work clearing a campsite that became the main camp, where then over the course of 2 weeks, the men divided into 2 teams to build 2 enormous dugout canoes from scratch. And so there were 2 different shipbuilding yards going on near the main campsite, while these guys, with only hand tools, axes and a scooping tool called an adze, and then machetes, set to work and down these 2 enormous trees. And in the course of 2 weeks created 2 huge dugout canoes. One was 60 plus feet long and the other was 47 feet long, enough to hold all 34 of us in all our gear. They made the benches, the paddles, all of it from hand. And that's how we got out of there, down that river. It's called the Jutai River, to a point where it was deep enough to radio, where it was clear enough to send a radio signal and deep enough for a boat to come get us. And so then we waited for a boat to come around and get us to complete the journey. But it was, so the exodus happened in kind of like stages. And it wasn't until several weeks later still that we actually got to the first town where there was refrigeration or electricity or anything like that, or restaurants. But it was, in a way, you're anxious to get out of there. I had kids waiting for me at home.
Probably missed your bed.
Well, actually, I got so used to sleeping in a hammock, it was really hard to adjust to a bed afterwards. Yeah.
So you were ready. You were eager to go, but there was some also. It sounds like you're saying there was a bit of a tension about leaving.
Yeah, there was. These guys that had taken such good care of me and who were my companions through this whole trip, it was hard to say goodbye to them, and not knowing if I'd ever see them again.
How long did it take for you to process, absorb, make sense of, and just feel what this was to you, like what this meant to you? I know you had a project to do. You had to write this book. But how did you process this? Was it through writing the book?
Well, in the end it was, but actually I didn't, it was a while before I set about to write a book. The first order of business was writing an article for National Geographic. And that was kind of difficult, actually.
How so?
Well, I didn't really know how to start it or, what to include. There was so much that happened over the course of, 2.5 months. And then the imperative of having to make a living kind of sent me back out on new assignments. But I did start doing talks about this experience in the Amazon and showing my slides. And as I did that, people would say, "Where's the book?" And eventually I decided, I have to do the book. So I dropped everything, wrote a book proposal, got a contract. And that was really when I think in a way, it was really as I was writing this book that I really started processing a lot of what had happened and what it all meant. Yeah.
When you look at those photos, either in the context of a presentation or the book, even all this time later, what do you feel when you see those images?
It was an extraordinary time in my life that I will never be able to repeat. I've gone back to the jungle, but never again in that kind of situation. I'm kind of amazed at myself that I actually did it.
Is there one image that stays with you most vividly?
It's one of me wading into the waters as we're going on the trek one day. It was actually a picture that I didn't take. Someone took it of me, knee deep in water, trekking through one of the streams. And it says something not only about, that moment, but also the sheer beauty of this area we were in, that there were these sandy bottom streams with golden water. And often you think of the jungle and you think of malaria and disease and so on, but we were moving in an area that was so pristine you could dip your cup right into the water and drink it.
What do you miss most from the whole thing? Besides the hammock.
I was going to say lying in the hammock and having the experience of hearing all those night sounds and I used to lie in my hammock with my headlamp and write. I wrote a lot of the notes that ended up in the book lying in my hammock at night before turning in, and I loved that.
Here's a question I don't want to ask, but I kind of do. What did the monkeys taste like?
Chicken. So the guys who were the cooks of the expedition, they would take these monkeys and, well, the indigenous people usually were the first to scrape off the skin and the fur, but then the cooks would hack the meat into these chunks and boil all of it in a pot until the meat turned gray. It was really unpleasant, frankly. Not a very nice taste at all, but it was survival in the jungle, and we needed the protein.
That was Scott Wallace, reflecting on 10 weeks in the Amazon with a team whose goal it was to protect the Arrow people without ever meeting them. After the break, these communities aren't just isolated, they are irreplaceable.
These groups are the last living remnants of a way of life that has all but vanished from the earth. And yet it is the way that humankind lived for millennia.
I'm Chion Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay tuned. This is Audacious. I'm Chion Wolf. Today we're talking with journalist and Yukon Associate Professor Scott Wallace about the experience he writes about in his book, The Unconquered. Scott spent 10 weeks deep in the Brazilian Amazon alongside legendary Indigenous rights advocate Sidney Pozuelo, whose life's work has been protecting uncontacted tribes by making sure they remain uncontacted. Next, we talk about where Pozuelo's mission stands, what threats these communities face today, and how this experience changed Scott forever. I asked him, when he finally got back home to the United States, what was the first ordinary thing that felt suddenly strange?
Making a phone call. Having that kind of technology like right there at my fingertips. Getting in a car, driving. Yeah, those things.
Before I move on to some bigger picture sort of reflections on this, is there anything that we missed from the story that you want to make sure we hear?
One thing that was really interesting, hearing the stories from the Indigenous people at night around the campfire. So there was the story I mentioned about the airplanes. But one of the things that stuck with me was a couple of them talked about the time when they first saw a white person. And in Brazil, anyone who's non-Indigenous is white. So homem branco, the white man. The first time they saw white men were loggers. And they spied on them from behind trees, and they were looking at them, and they couldn't understand, like, the shirts that the guys were wearing. They couldn't understand what they were. They thought they were, how do they change into skins that are like blue and red? And we want to do that too. So there are all sorts of, interesting perceptions. There was a story about a flashlight that had gotten left behind at a place where the Funai, the Indigenous Affairs officials, were trying to lure the tribe from the jungle, and they would set up what they called a traction altar with gifts of mirrors and machetes and aluminum pots and things like that. And on one occasion, a flashlight got left behind. This, by the way, was not a Machis story. This was from a different tribe. But this guy took the flashlight. Many years later, he told Pozuelo the story. It was actually Pozuelo's flashlight. He had taken it back to their maloka, their hut, and banging it. He was trying to bang this thing, this silver cylinder with an eye at one end, and in the middle of the night, it just lit up spontaneously, and everyone was freaked out. So they bashed this. They started bashing this flashlight and threw it in the fire. And then when the batteries exploded, they were like completely freaked out and thought that this was like some kind of demonic, spirit. So to sort of be around people who in, this lifetime thought that, airplanes crossing their sky were ancestral spirits, is quite extraordinary.
So what ended up happening with Pozuelo and protecting the Arrow people, and even, beyond that, the larger picture of protecting people beyond this tribe, what ended up happening?
As a result of the expedition, Pozuelo was able to bolster protections of of this territory for the Arrow people and the other uncontacted indigenous people living within it. This area, the Javari Valley Indigenous Territory, it's called, is the home of the largest concentration of so-called uncontacted tribes anywhere in the world. And the territory still remains quite intact, but is getting more pressure, particularly, this is way out on the border of Peru. It's a really remote part of Brazil. And it's also an area now where there's some serious drug trafficking going on and poachers getting in, trying to get into the territory. So the indigenous people themselves are now taking the step of organizing their own territorial, I don't know if defense is the right word, territorial. They monitor their territory and report to the authorities things that they encounter, intruders, signs of poachers coming in, whatever. So in the Javari, the uncontacted groups are still pretty well protected. There are no roads. This is a completely roadless area, but there is this danger of drug traffickers starting to move in and use the territory as a trampoline to move drugs, basically from Peru further east and on to Europe and North America. Other uncontacted groups, some of the groups are living on the run in constant fear of contact. I've reported extensively on another part of the Amazon, the eastern Amazon, where there is one uncontacted group of the Awa tribe who continue to hold forth in the core of this much smaller reserve that's invaded by loggers from all sides. They share the territory with a larger tribe called the Guajajara, who have taken it upon themselves to defend their territory and to defend this one uncontacted group at great risk to themselves. Several of the people that I know from working there have been murdered. But that one tribe is still alive and intact in the forest.
I've seen videos and news stories about people of a certain religious faith going to islands with uncontacted tribes and them getting murdered. And when you see those headlines and you read those stories, what goes through you?
Yeah, actually, I wrote a story about that guy in the Andaman Islands, John Chow.
Yes.
And
for those who don't know that story, briefly.
Yeah. So I think it was 2018, a young American missionary decided that he was going to take it upon himself to evangelize the Sentinelese people who live on an island in the Andaman Sea that have remained uncontacted. The Sentinelese on this island, the Great Sentinel Island, I think it's called, they are probably the purest of all the uncontacted tribes because they live alone on this island. No one else lives there. They have not been contacted except there've been violent encounters with some who have tried to come ashore to meet them. And they have driven off all intruders. And Chow, this young missionary, got it in his head that he would come ashore with a Bible and evangelize this group. And he was killed by them. With, I think, actually an arrow right through the Bible that he held forth in front of him. And I did write about this, and I spoke to officials in the Andaman Islands about, this intrusion And also the Geographic years ago had done a story. As a matter of fact, as a result of the story I wrote for the Geographic, they went back and found the original images of a photographer named Raghuveer Singh, who had joined an expedition by the Indian government to try to make contact with the Sentinelese back in the mid-1970s. And he took extraordinary images from the boat of the Sentinelese along the shore with their arrows and bows. And those pictures had never been published again since the article in the Geographic. But I knew about that article, and I drew that article to the attention because Raghuveer Singh, the photographer, was long gone. And they found the images and they digitized them, extraordinary images. But the attempt by the Indian government at that time to make contact with them, and they were repelled. And so eventually the Indians kind of followed Brazil's lead to create a new policy of no contact. So when I heard about that, I was really angry, actually, that, this kid had made that decision to try to do this. It's just, a combination, I think, of ignorance and arrogance that often characterizes our approach to, these sorts of situations.
How do you feel changed by this?
I think I came away feeling a deeper sense of empathy for people who are the most vulnerable. The uncontacted groups are the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. Indigenous people in general are extremely vulnerable, subject to climate change, to pressures on their territory, to the usurpation of their territory and dislocation from it. And I guess I feel, as a result of this, a redoubled commitment to try to do what I can to make the public aware of their plight and to arouse some sense of empathy for it.
I know we have just barely scratched the surface and people need to buy your book, The Unconquered by Scott Wallace. But is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to make sure you say?
One thing that I took away from this experience is the understanding that actually the Flecheiros and the few other tribes that still exist in an isolated state like the Flecheiros, there are maybe 60, 70. We don't know exactly how many. The Flecheiros are one of the largest groups and one of the best known ones. But these groups are the last living remnants of a way of life that has all but vanished from the earth. And yet it is the way that humankind lived for millennia before the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and exploration and all the things that have gone into making modern society. These groups are the only ones left who are able to survive without access to industrial goods from our economy. It's quite extraordinary.
Well, Scott Wallace, thank you so much for talking with me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Audacious is always lovingly produced by Jessica Severin de Martinez. Meg Fitzgerald is the Senior Manager of Projects and Radio Programming, and Robin Doyon-Aiken is the Deputy Director of Storytelling at Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford. Stay in touch with me on the socials at Chion Wolf. You can always send an email to audacious@ctpublic.org. Peace.